The August sun blazed mercilessly across Dakota Territory's endless prairie, its heat creating shimmering mirages that danced like spirits above grass, turned brittle gold under the relentless drought of 1876. From his concealed position atop Eagle's Perch Ridge, Maka tracked the dust cloud raised by 3 hard-riding horses through field glasses taken from a cavalry captain's corpse at Little Bighorn just 2 months prior. At 32, the Lakota warrior carried the wiry strength of a man, forged by warfare and survival on the northern plains. His buckskin shirt bore intricate beadwork from his late sister's hands, while a single eagle feather hung from hair that gleamed blue-black in the harsh afternoon light. The puckered scar running from his left shoulder toward his heart, a cavalry saber's reminder from Colonel Custer's last campaign, pulled tight as he studied the approaching riders. Through the lenses, what he saw made his jaw clench with familiar rage. The 3 men he'd been tracking for 4 days, Dead-Eye Dick with his scarred socket Whiskey Tom, whose massive frame belied his deadly speed, and Grinning Tom, whose cold smile never touched his pale eyes, weren't hunting alone. A woman fought desperately against Whiskey Tom's iron grip, her torn calico dress and auburn hair whipping in the wind as she struggled to break free from their shared saddle. The sharp crack of rifle fire split the scorching air. The woman had torn loose somehow, tumbling into the buffalo grass in a tangle of skirts and scattered papers that fluttered like dying birds. She scrambled upright with desperate grace, clutching a leather satchel to her chest, while Dead-Eye Dick wheeled his mount with practiced precision, leveling a Spencer carbine at her spine. Maka was already moving before conscious thought took hold, his war-trained pinto responding to subtle knee pressure as they plunged down the treacherous slope in a controlled avalanche of shale and prairie dust. The woman he could see, she was young, perhaps 26, with the determined jawline of German immigrant stock, raised her hands not in surrender, but defiant challenge. "These documents reach the territorial marshal if you harm me." Her voice carried clearly, despite her accent stronger than her fear. Dead-Eye Dick's laugh was like grinding millstones. "Lady, there won't be enough left of you to trouble a coyote, let alone any federal marshal." The Spencer's black muzzle was swinging toward her when Maka's war cry split the afternoon air, that bone-chilling sound that had scattered cavalry formations across the Yellowstone country. The rifle jerked toward this new threat, but the Lakota warrior was already flowing down his horse's flank in the ancient way, using the animal's body as living shield. The bullet meant for him sang harmlessly into the cloudless sky as his pinto crashed into Dead-Eye Dick's mount with bone-jarring impact. Both horses staggered, fighting for balance on the uneven ground, while Maka rolled from his saddle and sprinted toward the woman through grass that caught at his elk-hide moccasins. "Get down!" he shouted, diving behind a weathered buffalo wallow as Whiskey Tom's rifle barked behind them. Stone chips from embedded flint stung his cheek as he pressed against the woman's trembling form, her body unexpectedly warm and soft against his in their narrow shelter. Her emerald eyes met his without flinching, taking in his buckskin clothing and eagle feather with the swift assessment of someone accustomed to judging strangers' intentions and heartbeats. Despite her terror, intelligence sparked in those green depths, the kind of quick thinking that kept people alive on the frontier. "I'm Lucille Brennan," she whispered, still clutching the precious papers. "My husband was Felix Brennan, the surveyor." I knew Felix. He was an honest man. Maka drew his .45 Colt single-action army, a weapon claimed from that same cavalry captain who'd learned too late that arrogance made poor armor. What did he discover that's worth 3 hired killers? Proof of land theft, murder. Her voice carried controlled fury mixed with grief. "These papers document everything who's behind it, how they're stealing Lakota territory, all of it." Another bullet chewed their stone shelter, sending fragments whistling past their heads. Maka studied their position with cold calculation, born of surviving too many impossible fights. The three gunmen had them pinned, but overconfidence might make them careless. "Can you run when I give the word?" "Fast enough, I hope." He rose enough to snap two quick shots at grinning Tom, who was trying to flank their position. The gunmen dove for cover, cursing creatively, buying them precious seconds. Now, they broke from shelter in a desperate sprint across broken ground littered with buffalo chips and prickly pear. Behind them, rifles cracked in rapid succession bullets, kicking up dirt geysers around their flying feet. Lucille stumbled as her torn skirt snagged on rusted fence wire from an abandoned homestead, but Maka scooped her up without breaking stride, her weight familiar as a wounded comrade carried from battle. They tumbled into a shallow ravine as a bullet creased the air where her head had been moments before. The dry wash offered blessed cover, carved deep by spring floods and lined with rocks that would stop rifle rounds. Maka set her down gently, noting how her fingers lingered on his shoulders just a heartbeat longer than necessity required. Thunder of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their momentary safety. A stagecoach was racing along the main road at dangerous speed, its driver shouting encouragement to his lathered team while the shotgun guards scanned for trouble. "There's our chance," Maka said, grasping Lucille's hand. "If we can reach that coach." They scrambled up the ravine's far bank, Lucille gathering torn skirts while Maka provided covering fire. The stagecoach slowed as the driver spotted them, his weathered face showing frontier pragmatism that offered help first and asked questions later. "Trouble." The guard called double-barreled shotgun ready. "The worst kind," Maka replied, boosting Lucille through the coach door before swinging up beside the driver. "3 hired killers hunting a witness." The guard's eyes took in Maka's appearance and then shifted to the pursuing riders. Whatever prejudices he harbored against Indians took distant second place to his hatred of backshooters and woman killers. "Hold tight," the driver said grimly, cracking his whip. "Let's see if those bastards can catch 6 fresh horses on good road." The stagecoach lurched forward, wheels thundering over rutted track toward Willow Gap's promise of civilization. Behind them, Dead-Eye Dick and Whiskey Tom pulled up their blown mounts, unwilling to chase armed men in daylight, when witnesses might complicate explanations. Inside the bouncing coach, Lucille pressed against the window, watching endless prairie roll past, while her mind raced through implications. The papers she carried could destroy powerful men, but they had also drawn an innocent warrior into her desperate flight from justice denied. As Willow Gap appeared through heat shimmer, its collection of frame buildings promising sanctuary that might prove illusory, both Maka and Lucille understood they had crossed lines, admitting no retreat. Her evidence could expose corruption, reaching territorial government's highest levels. But it would also paint deadly targets on everyone who aided her cause. Willow Gap sprawled along the Ash River's banks, like civilization's ambitious but flawed attempt to impose order on wilderness. The town had grown around Lead Hill Mine's demands, its streets following no surveyor's plan, but the natural contours of commerce and human necessity. Frame buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their false fronts painted in colors that relentless sun and alkali wind had already begun bleaching to pale memories. The mine itself dominated the hillside like some mechanical beast feeding on the earth's entrails, its head frame and stamp mill belching steam and smoke across the valley. The rhythmic thunder of the stamps provided constant heartbeat for the community-pounding cadence that marked time for those who worked the claims and those who served them. Maka knew Willow Gap's rhythms and hidden dangers from frequent visits. Stares following him down Main Street ranged from curious to hostile depending on observers' experience with Indians and current sobriety levels. But he also knew which businesses would serve him without trouble and which men could be trusted to honor their word regardless of his heritage. Dr. Christian Bell fell into the latter category, though something about the physician had always struck Maka as mysteriously guarded. The man had set bones for Lakota warriors and delivered babies for settler families with equal competence. But there were moments when his medical knowledge seemed to extend beyond what frontier education typically provided. His small house on town's eastern outskirts served as both residence and surgery, offering care to anyone who could meet his modest fees. "We need someone we can trust completely," Maka said, helping Lucille down from the stagecoach with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than simple courtesy required. "Dr. Bell has always dealt fairly with my people." They walked through dusty streets, past Murphy's General Store, where men gathered to argue politics, and weather past the Silver Dollar Saloon, where piano music tinkled through smoke-hazed air. Maka's hand rested protectively on Lucille's back, a gesture that could be interpreted as courtesy or something more intimate, depending on observers' inclinations. Dr. Bell answered their knock with wariness, learned from experience that unexpected visitors often brought complications. At 58, he carried himself with quiet authority, earned from witnessing every form of human suffering. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes simple but immaculately clean, and his hands bore the gentle calluses of instruments rather than manual labor. "Maka," he said with genuine warmth that seemed to carry deeper currents. "And Mrs. Brennan, if I'm not mistaken. I heard about Felix, my deepest condolences." Something flickered across the doctor's face as he spoke her late husband's name, a brief shadow that might have been grief concern or something more complex. But it passed so quickly that Lucille almost thought she'd imagined it. "Thank you, Doctor," she replied carefully. "But we've come about considerably more than grief." Bell's sharp eyes catalogued their disheveled appearance, noting Maka's protective positioning the precious papers Lucille clutched with white-knuckled determination. Without another word, he stepped aside and gestured them into his surgery with practiced discretion. The room smelled of carbolic acid and medicinal whiskey, its shelves lined with bottles and gleaming instruments that spoke of education far beyond what most frontier physicians possessed. Bell motioned for Lucille to sit while he cleaned a shallow cut on her arm from their thornbush flight. "What kind of trouble has found you?" he asked, voice maintaining careful neutrality, while his hands worked with practiced efficiency. Lucille spread Felix's papers across the examination table, survey maps, claimed documents, and a leather-bound ledger filled with names and dollar amounts. Bell's expression grew increasingly troubled as he studied the evidence, and again that strange flicker of recognition crossed his features. "These land claims are expert forgeries," he said finally, pointing to official seals with steady fingers. "Extremely competent work, but fraudulent nonetheless." He flipped through the ledger's pages with movements that seemed almost familiar with the material. "And these payment records? Dear God, this documents bribes to half the territorial bureaucracy, including Sheriff Kellum." Maka observed, watching the doctor's reaction carefully. "Yes, most clearly." Bell set the papers down with careful precision. His voice carried a strange note when he continued. "Felix came to see me the night before he died. Frightened, said he'd discovered something that could cost him his life. He paused, seeming to wrestle with internal conflict. I thought he was being overly dramatic. The way he said it suggested there was more to that final conversation than he was revealing. Before anyone could pursue this soft knocking came at the back door in a specific pattern: 2 short, 3 long, 2 short. "That's Hazel," Bell said, with what might have been relief, though something in his tone suggested more complex emotions. He admitted a young woman whose intelligent brown eyes and prematurely silver hair marked her as someone aged through experience rather than mere time. At 25, Hazel Price carried herself with quiet confidence earned from teaching school for 3 years in Willow Gap. "I saw you arrive," she said without preamble, her gaze immediately taking in the papers spread across the examination table. For just a moment, her expression showed something that might have been recognition, quickly suppressed. "The entire town is talking about the widow woman and the Indian warrior. Sheriff Kellum is asking very pointed questions." "What sort of questions?" Maka asked, noting how both Hazel and Dr. Bell seemed to share some unspoken understanding. "The sort that usually end with someone being shot while resisting arrest." Hazel's eyes fixed on Felix's documents with unmistakable familiarity. "What exactly have you discovered?" As Bell explained the situation, Hazel studied the evidence with methodical attention that spoke of genuine understanding rather than mere curiosity. Her face grew progressively paler, but something in her posture suggested this information wasn't entirely surprising. "This explains the recent pattern of forced property sales," she said carefully. "Families who were prospering, suddenly finding themselves facing mysterious debts they swore they'd never incurred. Caro has been systematically acquiring property through fraud and intimidation," Lucille said, watching both their reactions. "Felix's surveys show he now controls most of the watershed. If he succeeds in diverting the river, it will destroy the Lakota winter camps." "The survey notations here," Hazel said, pointing to specific markings with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "These symbols near Phantom Ridge, I've seen them before. In family papers." "What family papers?" Maka asked sharply. Before Hazel could answer, Dr. Bell made a decision that changed everything. "There are things you need to know," he said quietly, his professional composure finally cracking. "About Felix, about these documents, about why certain people in this town have been so desperate to keep the truth buried." He moved to a locked cabinet, withdrawing a document that bore official territorial seals. "Felix Brennan was my son," he said simply, looking directly at Lucille. "Hazel is my daughter, both given up for adoption years ago to protect them from the shame of illegitimate birth, but never forgotten, never truly abandoned." The words hung in the surgery's carbolic-scented air like smoke from a dying fire. Bell's secret had been his children, born from relationships with different women during his younger years as a traveling physician, both educated with money he'd sent anonymously through intermediaries. When Felix discovered Caro's conspiracy, he came to me not just as a doctor, but as his father. Bell continued, voice heavy with decades of carefully guarded emotion. "He asked for advice about protecting evidence that could get him killed." "And you told him to hide it," Maka said, understanding, beginning to dawn. "I told him to make copies and secure them where they couldn't be destroyed even if he was eliminated. But what I couldn't tell him," Bell's voice broke slightly, "what I've lived with every day since his death is that Caro had discovered our relationship. He'd been blackmailing me for years, using that knowledge to ensure my cooperation with his medical needs and my silence about his activities." The revelation explained Bell's intimate knowledge of the documents, his apparent familiarity with Felix's work, and the guilt that had been eating at him since his son's murder. But it also raised new questions about trust and how much additional information they'd been withholding. "I helped them kill my own son." Bell whispered the words torn from him like confession. "Not directly, but by providing information about his habits, his health details that helped them plan his murder to look like an accident." Heavy boots thundered across the front porch before anyone could fully process this revelation. Bell peered through his curtains, face going ashen with recognition and fear. "Kellum and 8 deputies. They're surrounding the house completely. But this time there was something different about the sheriff's approach. Instead of a hasty raid, this was a carefully planned operation with multiple escape routes blocked and overwhelming force positioned for decisive confrontation. Someone told them exactly where we'd go. Maka said grimly, hand dropping to his weapon. Not someone. A familiar voice said from the surgery's back door. Me. Charlie Morrison stepped into view, his blacksmith's hammer replaced by a Winchester rifle, currently aimed at the floor, but ready to be raised with deadly quickness. The man who'd been a pillar of the community now stood before them with the unmistakable posture of betrayal. I'm sorry, he said, genuine regret in his voice, making his treachery more painful than simple greed would have been. Caro has my youngest daughter. Says he'll kill her if I don't deliver you to Kellum alive and with the papers intact. Charlie, Dr. Bell said softly, you know this won't end with just turning them over. Caro will eliminate everyone who knows the truth. Maybe. But if I don't cooperate, she dies for certain. At least this way she has a chance. It was the familiar calculus of impossible choices that frontier life imposed on decent people: sacrifice others to protect family, or watch loved ones die for principle. Morrison had made his choice, and the anguish in his eyes showed exactly how much it was costing him. There's another way, Hazel said suddenly, her schoolteacher's mind working through possibilities with methodical precision. The old mine workings under the schoolhouse connect to natural caves. If we can reach them. I've been feeding them information for weeks, Morrison said heavily, his voice breaking. Every escape route, every safe house, every person you might turn to for help. They know about the caves, the mine tunnels, all of it. That was when Maka made the decision that would determine all their fates. Instead of trying to fight or flee, he did something none of them expected. He walked directly toward the front door, hands raised, but not quite in surrender. Then we go through them, he announced quietly. Sometimes the only way out of a trap is straight through its center. I know the confrontation that followed would be remembered in Willow Gap's history as the moment when the town's soul was finally tested and, against overwhelming odds, found sufficient. Maka emerged from Dr. Bell's surgery with his hands raised, but his bearing proud, followed by Lucille clutching her precious papers, and the unlikely family trio bound together by secrets and guilt. Sheriff Tower Tom Kellum waited in the dusty street with enough firepower to level half the town, if necessary. His deputies had spread out in a semicircle, their rifles trained on the surgery with professional competence that spoke of careful planning and serious intent. But something was different about this confrontation. Instead of the empty street they'd expected, a crowd was gathering. Word of the standoff had spread with lightning speed that characterized small-town gossip, but this wasn't mere curiosity drawing people from their shops and homes. These were folks who'd been hearing whispers about strange goings-on, unexplained property transfers, and the kind of legal complications that seemed to follow Rupert Caro's business dealings like summer storms. That's far enough, Kellum called out when Maka was 20 paces away. You're all under arrest for conspiracy murder and inciting insurrection against territorial authority. Whose authority? A voice called from the crowd. The speaker was Jacob Muller, a German immigrant who'd built a prosperous bakery through 15 years of dawn-to-midnight labor. His thick accent couldn't disguise the steel in his voice as he continued. We hear many stories about Sheriff Kellum and mining company. Stories about honest men dying for asking questions. You'd best mind your own business, Muller. Kellum warned, but uncertainty crept into his voice. The crowd was larger than expected, and growing by the minute, their faces showing more anger than fear. This is our business, said Mary Patterson, the preacher's wife, who'd never been known to raise her voice above a church whisper. Felix Brennan was a good man. If he found wrongdoing, we have a right to know about it. That was when Lucille made her move. Instead of cowering behind Maka's protection, she stepped forward with the kind of courage that had carried her across an ocean to build a new life in harsh land. These papers prove that Sheriff Kellum and Rupert Caro have been stealing land through forged documents and murder. She announced, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd. My husband died trying to expose their crimes. Now they want to silence everyone who knows the truth. She began reading from Felix's ledger, names, dates, amounts that painted a picture of systematic corruption so comprehensive that even Kellum's supporters began questioning their allegiances. Bank President Henderson's falsified loan documents. Land Office Clerk Wilson's forged seals. Judge Morrison's bought verdicts. The crowd's murmur rose to angry voices as people recognized their own names among the victims. Those are lies, Kellum snarled, but his protest lacked conviction. Fabricated evidence from desperate criminals. Then you won't mind having them examined by federal authorities, Dr. Bell said, stepping forward with professional authority that had made him the community's most trusted citizen. Unless, of course, you have reasons for wanting them destroyed. The crowd was growing angrier, now voices rising as people realized they'd been systematically deceived by those they'd trusted with power. But Kellum still had his guns, and his desperation and desperate men with weapons were capable of terrible choices. I'm done talking, the sheriff announced, raising his pistol toward Lucille. Those papers are going to burn, and anyone who tries to stop me is joining them. That was when Charlie Morrison made his final choice. The blacksmith who'd been forced into betrayal by threats against his daughter suddenly stepped between Kellum's gun and its intended target, his massive frame providing human shield for the evidence that could save his community. No, he said simply. I won't be part of this anymore. You'll be part of whatever I say, or your daughter dies screaming, Kellum replied with casual cruelty. My daughter would rather die honest than live, knowing her father helped murder innocent people. Morrison replied, his voice steady despite the gun aimed at his chest. I should have made this choice long ago. The gunshot that followed echoed off the buildings surrounding Main Street, but it wasn't Kellum's weapon that spoke. From a second-story window above the barber shop, a rifle had cracked with perfect timing and deadly accuracy, taking the corrupt sheriff in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. That's for Felix Brennan, called a voice from the window, and for every honest person you've threatened in this town. The rifleman was Tom Bradley, who ran the town's largest general store and had been quietly documenting Caro's suspicious business dealings for months. His shot had been perfectly placed, wounding rather than killing, disarming rather than executing, showing the kind of frontier justice that left room for mercy even in righteous anger. What followed was not the massacre Kellum had planned, but a reckoning that had been building for years. Deputies found themselves surrounded by armed townspeople who'd finally learned the truth about what had been done in their name. Some threw down their weapons, immediately claiming they'd been deceived about their duties. Others tried to fight, but found themselves overwhelmingly outnumbered by citizens who'd reached the limits of their tolerance for corruption. The battle, such as it was, lasted less than 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared and dust settled, and Sheriff Kellum was wounded and disarmed, half his deputies were under citizen arrest, and the other half had fled town rather than face consequences of their actions. But even as they celebrated this victory, everyone present understood they'd won only the first battle in a larger war. Rupert Caro was still alive, still powerful, and still capable of immense damage if allowed to escape consequences of his crimes. Where is he? Morrison asked Kellum, his blacksmith strength evident as he hauled the wounded sheriff to his feet. It was one of Kellum's own deputies, a young man named Peters, who joined the force thinking he was serving justice, who provided the answer they needed. Phantom Ridge, he said quietly. Caro's been building some kind of major construction project up there. Enough equipment and supplies for something big working around the clock with crews brought in from Colorado and Texas. Maka and Lucille exchanged glances, understanding immediately what this revelation meant. Caro hadn't abandoned his plans to control the region's water supply. He'd simply moved them to a location where he thought he could work without interference. "What kind of construction?" Maka asked. "A dam," Peters replied. "Massive stone and concrete barrier designed to block Storm Creek and create a reservoir that will flood everything downstream, including the Lakota burial grounds. With or without legal authority, he plans to make that land unusable for traditional purposes." The implications were staggering. Even if they'd exposed Caro's corruption and neutralized Sheriff Kellum, the mine owner could still accomplish his primary objective through brute force engineering. The sacred sites would be destroyed, the winter grazing lands would be lost forever, and the Lakota people would face starvation or reservation life. "How long before the dam is completed?" Dr. Bell asked. 2 days, maybe 3 if we can delay the work somehow," Peters replied. He's been driving his crews 24 hours a day to finish before word of today's events reaches the territorial capital. The race was on a desperate effort to prevent an ecological and cultural catastrophe that would be irreversible once the concrete was poured and water began to rise. But unlike their urban confrontation, this battle would take place on Caro's chosen ground, defended by his most loyal followers and protected by terrain that heavily favored defensive positions. "We need more than good intentions," Morrison said pragmatically. "We need a plan that can work against professional killers in fortified positions." "The dynamite supplies at Bradley's store," Tom Bradley said grimly. "It's not much, but it might be enough to cause some damage." As the impromptu alliance of townspeople and Lakota warriors began organizing for what might be their final confrontation, both Maka and Lucille understood they'd reached the point where all their previous struggles had been leading. Everything they'd fought for, everyone they'd tried to protect, and all their hopes for a future worth building hung in the balance of the next few days. The afternoon sun was already beginning its slide toward the western mountains, and with darkness would come new dangers and new opportunities in equal measure. They'd won a significant victory in Willow Gap, but the war for the territory's soul was far from over. The final battle awaited them at Phantom Ridge, where Rupert Caro was making his last, desperate gambit to seize control of the land, so the water and the future itself. The trail to Phantom Ridge wound through country that seemed designed by a malevolent deity to test human endurance and break human will. Steep switchbacks carved into sheer rock faces, where a single misstep meant death on jagged stones, hundreds of feet below loose scree fields that could trigger avalanches with each footfall, and stands of fire-blackened timber that turned simple progress into an exhausting obstacle course of fallen logs and hidden pitfalls. As dawn broke gray and cold on September 15th, Maka led a column of 47 men and women up the treacherous mountain path, their mixed composition representing every ethnic group and social class in Willow Gap. Charlie Morrison had proven surprisingly competent as a military organizer, dividing their force into teams that combined the townspeople's superior firepower with Lakota warriors' intimate knowledge of mountain warfare tactics. Dr. Bell rode with the medical supplies, his earlier revelations about family relationships, and forced cooperation with Caro having somehow strengthened rather than weakened the group's trust in his commitment to justice. The guilt he carried over his son's death had transformed into fierce determination to see Caro's conspiracy exposed and punished. But it was the growing bond between Maka and Lucille that had become the emotional center of their unlikely alliance. The physical dangers they'd faced together, combined with the gradual revelation of family secrets and hidden loyalties, had forged something deeper than mere partnership between the Lakota warrior and German immigrant widow. Felix's survey notes mention water flow patterns that could be crucial, Lucille said, consulting the precious papers as they paused at a switchback, offering their first clear view of Phantom Ridge. If Caro's dam depends on specific geological features, there might be weaknesses we can exploit. The construction sounds are getting louder. Hazel observed her schoolteacher's training, making her naturally attentive to details others might miss. That rhythmic pounding suggests they're working with heavy machinery, probably steam-powered. The implications were both encouraging and ominous. Steam engines meant Caro had invested heavily in this project, bringing in equipment that would be difficult to replace if destroyed. But they also meant he had the industrial capacity to complete his dam in record time, turning their race against the calendar into an even more desperate gamble. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the sounds of industrial activity became unmistakable. The ring of hammers on steel, the rumble of heavy wagons loaded with stone and cement, the periodic crack of dynamite charges opening new channels through solid granite. Caro's operation was working around the clock to complete their dam before outside interference could stop them. But there were other sounds as well, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood their significance. The traditional Lakota death songs that had been echoing from hidden positions throughout the night, preparing warrior spirits for the battle that would determine their people's future. Winona and the others are already in position, Maka said quietly, recognizing the specific cadences that indicated his cousin and her band of warriors had successfully infiltrated the area under cover of darkness. The final approach to Phantom Ridge required abandoning their horses and proceeding on foot through terrain so treacherous that even experienced mountain climbers would have found it challenging. Ancient rock slides had created a maze of house-sized boulders and hidden crevasses, while stands of stunted pine provided concealment but also blocked lines of sight that could be crucial in combat. As they worked their way through this natural fortress, Maka found himself moving beside Lucille, with the kind of unconscious coordination they'd developed through weeks of shared danger. She had proven capable of matching his pace over the roughest ground, and her presence at his side had become as natural and necessary as breathing. "Whatever happens up there," she said quietly during a brief rest behind a massive granite boulder, "I want you to know that these months with you have changed everything I thought I knew about courage, honor, and what it means to fight for something larger than yourself. Even with people trying to kill us at every turn. Especially then. There's something about facing death together that strips away everything false and leaves only what's real and precious." Before he could respond to the emotion in her voice, she did something that surprised them both, rising on her toes to kiss him. With desperate tenderness, her lips soft and warm against his in the cool mountain air. It wasn't passion born of desperation, but something deeper and more enduring, a recognition of feelings that had been growing beneath the surface of their partnership. "For whatever comes next," she whispered against his mouth, then smiled with the kind of courage that had carried her through everything they'd faced together. Their moment of intimacy was shattered by urgent signals from scouts ahead, hand gestures indicating enemies in large numbers and immediate danger. The tender feelings vanished as both shifted into the heightened awareness necessary for survival in the deadly hours ahead. Phantom Ridge spread before them like a scene from industrial hell. The natural beauty of the mountain meadow had been transformed into a scarred wasteland of construction equipment, supply dumps, and partially completed engineering works. Steam engines belched black smoke into the pristine mountain air, while gangs of workers labored to complete sections of what would become the largest dam in territorial history. But it was the figure directing operations from atop the completed portion of the dam that drew Maka's attention with magnetic force. Rupert Caro had aged visibly since their last encounter. his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his expensive clothes stained with mud and sweat of someone who'd been personally supervising every detail of construction. His voice carried clearly across the work site as he shouted instructions to his crews. "I want those final charges placed within the hour. Once we flood that valley, there won't be enough left of the Indian problem to worry a territorial governor." The casual callousness of his words crystallized everything evil about Caro's vision for the territory's future. This wasn't development or progress. It was genocide disguised as engineering designed to destroy a people's connection to their ancestral lands through the simple expedient of drowning their sacred sites under thousands of tons of water. "Positions," Morrison whispered to his scattered teams, and the final battle for Phantom Ridge began with the kind of coordinated precision that would have impressed regular army commanders. The attack opened with Winona's warriors creating diversions on the construction site's periphery. Individual fighters appearing and disappearing like ghosts among the rocks and timber, drawing fire and attention while the main assault force maneuvered into position. War cries echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by acoustics, until it seemed as though hundreds of warriors were descending on Caro's operation. The mine owners' hired guards responded with professional competence. But they were facing an enemy that fought by rules they didn't understand and couldn't predict. Every time they concentrated fire on one position, attackers would appear somewhere else, forcing them to constantly shift their defensive focus, while never knowing where the next threat would emerge. But the real devastation came from Tom Bradley, the mild-mannered storekeeper who'd never fired a shot in anger before this day. He had worked his way to within 50 yards of the main dynamite storage area, with the patience of someone who'd spent years managing inventory and understanding systems. "Fire in the hole," he shouted, lighting a fuse that would give everyone precious seconds to seek cover before the world exploded around them. The detonation that followed was spectacular beyond description. Carefully stockpiled explosives meant to complete the dam's construction instead obliterated months of work in a series of chain reactions that brought down half the mountainside. The sound was like God's own thunder echoing across the territory and rattling windows in towns 50 miles away. But the explosion had done more than destroy Caro's industrial dream. It had destabilized the entire ridge. Deep within the mountain, ancient geological structures that had been weakened by decades of mining were finally giving way under the blast's tremendous shock waves. The ground beneath their feet began to shift and crack, sending boulders the size of houses tumbling into the valleys below. "The whole ridge is coming apart," Dr. Bell shouted over the ominous rumbling that was growing louder by the second. What followed was a nightmare retreat through collapsing terrain, where solid rock was turning to treacherous rubble, and established trails were disappearing into crevasses that opened without warning. The mountain itself seemed to be fighting their efforts to escape with each step, potentially their last as the ancient granite foundations shifted and settled into new configurations. Maka and Lucille found themselves separated from the main group during the chaotic evacuation, trapped on a narrow ledge when the trail they'd been following disappeared into a slide of loose stone and uprooted trees. Above them, more debris was breaking loose from the cliff face, while below yawned a chasm that had opened during the explosion. But they weren't alone on the unstable ledge. Rupert Caro emerged from behind a fallen boulder, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, but his eyes still bright with the kind of rage that comes when carefully laid plans are destroyed by forces beyond control. In his hands was a Colt single-action army, its barrel aimed directly at Lucille's heart. "You've destroyed everything." He snarled, his voice barely audible over the rumbling of shifting rock. Years of planning, millions of dollars in investment, all ruined by a dead surveyor's papers and his meddling widow. "We've stopped you from committing genocide," Lucille replied, her voice steady despite the gun aimed at her chest. Felix died to protect innocent people from predators like you. Your husband was a fool who didn't understand the realities of progress. This territory needs strong leadership, not sentimental nonsense about Indian burial grounds and traditional ways. Caro's finger was tightening on the trigger when another section of the cliff face gave way above them, sending a cascade of rocks crashing down toward their precarious position. Maka threw himself across Lucille's body, shielding her from the falling debris while Caro scrambled for new cover. In the confusion that followed the ledge they stood on began to crack and tilt toward the abyss below. Maka grabbed Lucille around the waist, looking desperately for some way to reach safety as their foothold crumbled beneath them. There, Lucille pointed to an old rope bridge spanning the gap, a construction left over from earlier mining operations, now their only hope of reaching safety before the ledge gave way entirely. The bridge was ancient and had never been designed to carry much weight, but it was their only option as rocks continued falling around them with increasing frequency. Maka tested the first few planks carefully, then beckoned Lucille to follow as they began their desperate crossing. They were halfway across when Caro appeared at the near end of the bridge, his Colt single-action army trained on them with deadly intent. "End of the line." He called out, his voice carrying clearly across the chasm. "You've cost me everything, and now I'm going to return the favor." But as Caro stepped onto the bridge, the additional weight proved too much for the ancient rope structure. With a sound like thunder, the bridge's anchor points gave way, sending all three of them plummeting toward the rocks below. Maka's warrior reflexes saved their lives. As they fell, he managed to grab onto a protruding root growing from the canyon wall, arresting their descent with a bone-jarring impact that nearly tore his arm from its socket. Lucille dangled below him, her hands gripping his wrist with desperate strength, while Caro continued falling into the darkness, his screams echoing off the stone walls until distance finally swallowed the sound. For a terrifying moment, they hung suspended over the abyss, while the mountain continued its convulsions around them. Lucille's weight was pulling Maka's grip loose from the root, and he could feel his strength beginning to fail under the strain. "Let me go," she said quietly, looking up at him with eyes full of love and acceptance. "Save yourself." "Never," he replied through gritted teeth, using strength born of desperation and love to swing them both toward a narrow outcrop where they could rest briefly and plan their next move. "We live together or die together, but we don't surrender." The ascent that followed tested every skill Maka had learned during years of mountain warfare, while Lucille proved that frontier life had given her reserves of courage and endurance she'd never had to tap before this moment. Hand over hand, step by precarious step, they climbed toward daylight and the hope of reunion with their friends. When they finally reached solid ground and could see the main group of survivors in the distance, both of them understood that they'd crossed more than just a physical chasm. The crisis had burned away the last barriers between them, leaving something pure and unbreakable that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. As they stumbled toward the rendezvous point, supporting each other over the rough ground, Maka pulled Lucille close and spoke the words that had been in his heart since their first desperate flight across the prairie. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because of what we've been through, but because of who you are. Your courage, your strength, your refusal to be broken by anything life throws at you." "I love you too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something larger than yourself, to stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost." Their kiss was fierce and desperate, tasting of dust and fear, and the overwhelming relief of survival against impossible odds. When they finally broke apart, both of them understood that they'd found something worth building a future around, not just love, but partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The sounds of celebration in the distance told them that their friends had survived the mountain's collapse and Caro's final desperate gambit. The dam was destroyed, the mine owner was dead, and the evidence of his crimes was safe in the hands of people who would ensure it reached the proper authorities. But more than that, they'd proven that ordinary people could stand together against corruption and injustice when leadership was strong enough to show them the way, and stakes were high enough to justify the cost. The future stretched before them, full of uncertainty and challenge, but also rich with promise for those brave enough to seize it. 6 months after the Battle of Phantom Ridge, as it came to be known in territorial newspapers and frontier ballads, Willow Gap had transformed into something unprecedented in Dakota territory. The changes were visible everywhere. Lakota children learning to read alongside German and Irish immigrants. In Hazel's expanded schoolhouse, Dr. Bell's clinic, treating patients who paid in everything from silver dollars to beautifully crafted beadwork, and Charlie Morrison's blacksmith shop where traditional horseshoes were forged next to metal tools designed according to native specifications. The territorial investigation that followed Caro's death had resulted in the largest corruption prosecution in Dakota history. Dozens of officials were removed from office. New laws were passed requiring transparent land transactions, and federal oversight was established to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. Territorial court injunctions and federal oversight formally protected specific Lakota wintering grounds and burial sites on the Storm Creek watershed. But perhaps the most significant change was taking place in the small cabin overlooking Storm Creek that Maka and Lucille had built together during the long summer months following their marriage. The ceremony itself had been conducted according to both Lakota and Christian traditions, with Winona and Dr. Bell standing as family representatives, while the entire community celebrated the union of two peoples through the love of two individuals. Now, as winter's first snow dusted the high peaks and the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold in the crisp October air, they were preparing for the most important event of their shared life. Dr. Bell had confirmed that Lucille's pregnancy was progressing normally, and their child was expected within days. "I keep thinking about what kind of world we're bringing this baby into," Lucille said on the evening of October 20th, settling carefully into the rocking chair Maka had crafted from local pine. Her pregnancy showed clearly now, her body carrying their future with the kind of graceful strength that made her even more beautiful in his eyes. "A better world than the one we inherited," Maka replied, adding another log to the fire that warmed their home against the approaching winter. That's all any parent can hope for, to leave their children something better than what they found. And if we've learned anything from all this, Lucille added her hand, resting on the gentle swell where their child waited to be born. It's that change is possible when people are willing to fight for it. Outside their window, the sounds of evening carried familiar comforts, children calling to each other as they finished their chores, horses being settled in corrals, and the distant singing from the Lakota camp, where families gathered around communal fires. It was peaceful, but both of them understood that this peace had been earned through struggle and sacrifice that would not be forgotten. A gentle knock at their door interrupted the quiet conversation. Maka rose to answer it, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, before recognizing Dr. Bell's familiar silhouette against the starlit sky. "Evening, folks," the doctor said, stamping snow from his boots. "Just thought I'd check on our expectant mother." But as he examined Lucille, his experienced hands confirmed what his medical training had already suggested from her earlier symptoms. "I think we'd better prepare for delivery," he said with professional calm. "Your child has decided tonight is the right time to meet the world." What followed was the timeless drama of birth hours of labor, punctuated by moments of fear and periods of exhaustion, with Maka doing everything possible to help while recognizing that this was one battle he couldn't fight for the woman he loved. But Dr. Bell's presence provided not just medical expertise, but the comfort of family, as his relationship to Felix had made him grandfather by extension to the child about to be born. When dawn finally broke over Storm Creek Valley on October 21st, 1877, it brought with it the sound both parents had been waiting to hear, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn child announcing her arrival in the world. "A daughter, Doctor," Bells said with satisfaction, placing the tiny, perfect infant in Lucille's arms. Beautiful, and apparently determined to make her opinions known to everyone within hearing distance. Maka looked down at his daughter, their daughter, with the kind of awe that comes when confronted with the miracle of new life. She had her mother's delicate features, but the dark hair and eyes that spoke of her mixed heritage regarding the world around her, with the serious expression of someone who intended to take life on her own terms. "What shall we call her?" he asked. "Hope," Lucille replied without hesitation. "Because that's what she represents, hope for a future better than anything we inherited." "Hope," Maka repeated, testing the sound of it in both English and Lakota. "Kate Wangji." Yes, that's a good name for a warrior's daughter. As he held his child for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers grasp his with surprising strength, Maka understood that Hope would inherit more than just her parents' dreams. She would grow up in a community where the old divisions between peoples had begun to blur, where children learned from teachers who valued wisdom regardless of its source, and where justice was available to anyone brave enough to demand it. 3 years later, on a bright spring morning in 1880, Hope took her first confident steps across the cabin floor, while her parents watched with the kind of wonder that comes from witnessing a miracle unfold in ordinary time. The little girl had her father's fearless curiosity and her mother's determined independence, moving through the world with the kind of confidence that comes from being loved unconditionally by parents who had fought for the right to build their family on their own terms. "Look, Papa," Hope called in the mixture of English and Lakota that was becoming her natural language. "I can walk to the creek." "Not alone," Maka replied, scooping her up in arms that had once carried weapons, but now more often held children and the tools of peaceful construction. "We walk together. Remember, family stays together." As they made their way toward the water where Storm Creek sang its eternal song over stones worn smooth by countless seasons, all three of them understood that they were part of something larger than their individual family. They were part of a community experiment in cooperation and mutual respect. Proof that people from different backgrounds could build something together that was stronger and more beautiful than anything they could achieve alone. By the time Hope reached her 5th birthday, she had become something of a local celebrity. She attended Hazel's school with children whose grandparents had been mortal enemies, played games that combined traditions from multiple cultures, and spoke 3 languages with the easy fluency of someone who'd never questioned her right to belong in any of them. "Tell us about the old days," Hope's friend Sarah Morrison asked one afternoon as a group of children gathered around the stump in the schoolyard that served as their storytelling circle. "There weren't really old days," Hope replied with the wisdom of someone who'd grown up taking diversity for granted. "Just different days. My mama and papa met when bad people were trying to hurt folks and steal their land. But they fought together and won, and that's why all of us can be friends now." The story she told was simplified for her young audience, but it contained all the essential elements: courage in the face of injustice, the power of cooperation between different peoples, and the kind of love that could bridge any divide when people were willing to meet each other with open hearts and minds. "Miss Hazel says that differences make us stronger." Hope continued, unconsciously echoing lessons her aunt had been teaching for years. "Like when we braid different colored threads together to make rope that won't break." When school ended that afternoon, Hope ran home to the cabin where her parents waited with news that would complete their family's happiness. Lucille was expecting their second child, and Dr. Bell had confirmed that both mother and baby were healthy and developing normally. "Will you love the new baby as much as you love me?" Hope asked with the directness of childhood. "We will love the new baby differently than we love you," Maka replied carefully. "Because each person is unique and deserves their own special kind of love. But we will never love you less because we love someone else more." As summer turned to autumn and Lucille's pregnancy progressed, the cabin beside Storm Creek became a gathering place for the extended family that had grown around the unlikely partnership between a Lakota warrior and a German immigrant widow. Hazel visited regularly to share lesson plans and discuss her students' progress, while Dr. Bell had become the grandfather Hope had never known she needed. When their second child, a son they named Thomas Felix in honor of fallen friends, was born in December 1880, Hope proved herself a devoted big sister who took her responsibilities seriously. She helped with feeding, entertained him with stories and songs that combined Lakota traditions with German lullabies, and appointed herself his protector against any perceived threats. "She has the heart of a warrior," Maka observed, watching his daughter carefully guide her toddler brother away from the creek's edge during one of their family walks. "She has the heart of someone who understands that protecting others is the most important job anyone can have," Lucille corrected gently. "Whether that makes her a warrior, a teacher, a healer, or something we don't have a name for, yet remains to be seen." As the sun set over Storm Creek Valley on that autumn evening in 1883, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the water flowing toward distant seas, the family that had been forged in violence and tempered by love understood that they had accomplished something rare in American history. They had helped create a place where different peoples could live together, not as conquerors and conquered, but as neighbors and partners bound together by shared hopes and mutual responsibility. For the world they would leave to their children. It wasn't perfect, no human community ever could be, but it was alive and growing and full of promise for the future that Hope and Thomas would inherit. "What story should I tell the children tomorrow?" Hope asked, referring to her regular visits to the schoolhouse where she helped Hazel with the younger students. "Tell them about the bridge," Lucille suggested. "About how your father and I learned that the strongest bridges aren't made of wood or stone, but of trust and love, and the willingness to meet each other halfway." Hope nodded solemnly, already planning how she would explain such complex ideas to children who took harmony for granted because they'd never known anything else. It was a good problem to have, she thought, figuring out how to teach tolerance to people who'd never learned intolerance in the first place. Outside their window, Storm Creek sang its eternal song over stones worn smooth by countless seasons of snowmelt and summer storms. The water carried with it the promise of spring floods and autumn frosts, of cycles that would continue long after the current generation had passed into memory. But it also carried with it the knowledge that some changes once made could become permanent if they were tended with sufficient care and protected with adequate determination. The partnership between Maka and Lucille had begun in violence and desperation, but it had grown into something that served as foundation for the kind of community that could endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Their daughter Hope embodied that future, strong enough to fight when fighting was necessary, wise enough to build when building was possible, and loving enough to see the humanity in everyone she met. As the family settled in for the night, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle and Hope reading quietly by the fireplace, Maka and Lucille understood that they had been given a precious gift. Not just the children who would carry their legacy forward, but the knowledge that love could indeed conquer hate when it was backed by courage, sustained by justice, and nurtured by the daily choice to build something better than what had come before. It was not the ending either of them had expected when they first met in circumstances of violence and desperation. But it was the beginning, and they had both needed to create something worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible, and that they knew, with absolute certainty, would always be enough.